Your container soil may be dying beneath a plant that still looks alive. The tomato is green, the pepper still has fruit, and the okra is still standing. But every afternoon the leaves collapse, the flowers fall, and the next flush of growth looks smaller than the last. You water in the morning. You add fertilizer because the plant looks hungry. Yet the water races down the side of the pot, the surface turns hard again, and the plant struggles before the day is over. That is not always a sign that the plant needs more water or more food. It can be a sign that the root zone has lost the balance that made the container productive in the first place. Today we are going to rebuild that balance with 15 regenerative soil practices designed for tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, beans, okra, leafy greens, root crops, and other summer crops growing in pots, buckets, grow bags, and patio planters. Some of these practices can help immediately without disturbing the roots. Others prepare the soil for the next crop. And one of the most important lessons is knowing when a container should not be saved at all. Before you add anything, look closely at the soil. Healthy potting mix does not have to be dark, wet, or full of visible organisms at every moment, but it should still accept water, hold enough moisture for the roots, drain excess water, and contain spaces where air can move. When a mix becomes exhausted, one or more of those functions begins to fail. The top may pull away from the sides of the container. Water may disappear around the edge, while the center of the root ball stays dry. In another pot, water may sit on the surface because the mix has collapsed into fine particles. A third container may drain well, but show a white crust from repeated fertilizer applications. These problems can produce similar symptoms above the soil, including wilting, yellowing, weak new growth, blossom drop, and reduced harvests. That is why the first regenerative practice is not compost, mulch, worms, or fertilizer. It is diagnosis. A useful way to separate these conditions is to think in layers. The surface tells you what sun and irrigation have done during the last few hours. The middle of the pot tells you whether moisture is reaching the main root mass. The bottom tells you whether water can escape. A dry surface above a moist center may be completely normal. A wet surface above a dry center suggests channeling. A moist surface above a saturated bottom suggests slow drainage or a blocked outlet. You do not need expensive equipment to notice these patterns. A wooden skewer, inserted carefully near the outer wall, can sometimes reveal whether the lower mix is damp, but avoid forcing it through dense roots. For large containers, check more than one location because the side facing afternoon sun may dry much faster than the shaded side. The crop also changes the interpretation. A tomato with a large leaf canopy can move a tremendous amount of water on a hot, windy day. So the same pot that stayed moist in June may dry much faster in July. Pepper leaves may curl or droop while the plant protects itself from heat, even before the soil is completely dry. Okra can tolerate heat above the soil, but still loses productivity when a small container repeatedly dries around the roots. Leafy greens may become bitter, tough, or quick to bolt when heat and moisture stress arrive together. Radishes, carrots, and beets can become uneven or woody when the soil repeatedly swings from very dry to very wet. The diagnosis is not only about saving a plant today. It is about protecting the quality of the harvest still developing below or above the surface. Start with a slow watering test. Pour a small amount of water across the surface and watch what happens. If the water immediately runs into a gap between the soil and the wall of the pot, the center may still be dry. If it beads on top or moves across the surface without soaking in, part of the mix may have become water resistant after drying too far. If the water forms a puddle and remains there, the surface may be compacted or the lower part of the container may already be saturated. If water exits the drainage holes almost immediately, do not assume the entire root zone is wet. Fast drainage can mean good structure, but it can also mean water is following one narrow channel through dry soil. Two containers can look equally dry from above, while holding completely different amounts of moisture around the roots. Use the plant itself as another clue. Temporary wilting during the hottest part of the afternoon can happen even when moisture is present. especially when the leaves are losing water faster than the roots can replace it. If the plant recovers after sunset, that does not automatically mean you should flood the pot. But if the leaves are still limp the next morning, the root zone deserves immediate attention. Check the weight of the container if it is small enough to lift safely. A very light pot often indicates dryness. A heavy pot with a wilted plant may point toward poor aeration, damaged roots, or water trapped in the lower portion. Smell near the drainage holes. A mild, earthy smell is normal. A sour or stagnant odor can suggest that the mix has remained wet and oxygen poor. Look for a white or gray crust on the surface and around the rim. That may indicate mineral or fertilizer salt accumulation, especially when the plant also shows burned leaf edges. Do not dig aggressively to find an answer. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, beans, and many leafy crops produce fine absorbing roots close to the surface and around the walls of the container. Repeatedly pushing a tool deep into the mix can damage the very roots you are trying to protect. Instead, combine several gentle observations. Watch how the water enters. Feel the upper inch with a finger where that is safe and practical. Check the weight of the pot. Examine the drainage. Observe whether the plant recovers overnight. Look for crusting, shrinkage, or a surface that has become almost solid. Diagnosis may take a few minutes, but it prevents the common mistake of treating every stressed plant with the same solution. The second practice is to rehydrate overly dry soil gradually. Potting mixes that contain peat, coir, bark, or other organic materials can become difficult to wet evenly after they dry excessively. Pouring a large volume of water all at once often sends most of it around the edges. Instead, apply a small amount slowly across the surface, pause, and let the first moisture begin to penetrate. Then water again. Repeat until the mix accepts water more evenly and a modest amount begins to drain from the bottom. For a portable container, bottom watering for a limited period can sometimes help re-wet a dry root ball, but the pot should not be left standing in water indefinitely. The goal is to restore even moisture, not to replace drought stress with oxygen deprivation. If the root ball has shrunk badly, one watering session may not restore uniform moisture. Recheck later the same day, especially near the center and on the sun-facing side. Water may have softened the outer layer while leaving a dry core. A slow drip from a small emitter, a watering wand set to a gentle flow, or several measured passes with a watering can help. Directing all the water into one hole is less effective than distributing it over the usable surface. With a mature plant, the roots may occupy almost the entire pot, so water around the full circumference rather than only beside the stem. Morning is usually the most practical time to correct moisture, because the plant begins the day with a better water supply and the gardener can observe drainage. During an exceptional heat event, a container may still need a second check later, but do not automatically add water because the leaves droop at 3 in the afternoon. Test the soil first. If it remains moist, adding more can reduce oxygen around the roots. If it is genuinely dry, water the soil slowly and avoid spraying hot foliage unnecessarily. A consistent routine based on observation is more regenerative than alternating neglect with emergency flooding. Once the soil has been rehydrated, change the watering pattern that allowed it to become severely dry. A large tomato in a 5-gallon bucket may need more frequent attention than a young pepper in a larger insulated planter. A terracotta pot loses moisture differently from a plastic pot. A fabric grow bag allows excellent gas exchange, but may dry quickly in wind and heat. Do not water by the calendar alone. Water according to the container, the crop, the weather, and the actual moisture in the root zone. Deep, deliberate watering is usually more useful than repeated light splashes that wet only the surface. Yet deep watering does not mean drowning the pot. It means applying enough water, slowly enough, to reach the active roots while allowing excess water to escape. The third practice is to reduce heat entering through the container itself. In extreme summer weather, the root zone can be stressed even when the leaves receive adequate shade. Dark plastic pots, black nursery containers, metal planters, and grow bags placed directly on hot concrete can absorb and transfer significant heat. Move the container away from a south or west wall that radiates warmth late in the day when possible. Place it where the plant still receives the light it needs, but the pot is protected from the harshest afternoon sun. A light-colored outer sleeve, a larger decorative pot with an air gap, a wooden crate, or a simple shade panel can reduce direct solar heating. Whatever method you choose, keep the drainage holes open and allow air to move around the container. The bottom of the pot matters too. Concrete, asphalt, dark decking, and stone can remain hot after the sun begins to drop. Raising a container slightly on stable pot feet or a slatted platform can improve drainage and reduce direct contact with a hot surface. The support must be strong, level, and safe, especially with a large wet container. Grouping pots can also help shade some sidewalls, but do not pack them so tightly that airflow disappears or pests remain hidden. Tall, heat-loving crops such as okra or eggplant can sometimes cast useful shade on smaller pots, but the smaller crops must still receive enough light. Regenerative soil care is not only about what you add to the mix, it is also about reducing the stress that causes the mix and the roots to fail. Container size and root density change heat risk. A small pot contains less thermal mass and less moisture, so it heats and dries quickly. A root-bound plant also has less unused mix to buffer changes. If a young crop is clearly undersized for its container and the season is not too advanced, moving it into a larger pot can improve both moisture stability and root temperature. Choose a container with drainage and enough volume for the mature crop. Tomatoes and eggplants usually need more root space than compact herbs or shallow-rooted greens. Do not solve a volume problem by adding several competing plants to the same pot. Shade the container before shading the entire plant whenever possible. Fruiting vegetables still need adequate light, and excessive shade can reduce flowering and growth. A panel that blocks late afternoon sun from the side of the pot may protect the roots while leaving the canopy in useful light. In a balcony garden, a railing planter, bamboo screen, or neighboring container can provide that side protection. The best arrangement often changes through the season as the sun angle moves. Observe which side becomes hot rather than assuming the same position works in every month. The fourth practice is to keep the soil surface covered with an appropriate organic mulch. Bare potting mix is directly exposed to sun, wind, and the impact of irrigation. A mulch layer slows evaporation, reduces surface crusting, limits soil splash onto leaves, and buffers rapid temperature changes. Clean straw, shredded dry leaves, fine bark made for horticultural use, or another clean plant-based material can work. For many vegetable containers, a layer around 1 to 2 inches deep is a practical starting point. The right depth depends on the size of the pot, the material, rainfall, airflow, and how quickly the mix dries. A very small pot may need less. A large grow bag in dry heat may benefit from more consistent coverage. Mulch must remain loose enough for water and air to move. Do not press it into a dense, wet mat. If the material begins to shed water, move it gently and water beneath it. If it becomes slimy, moldy, or constantly saturated, reduce the thickness and improve airflow. Mulch is a protective layer, not a lid. It does not correct poor drainage in the lower part of the pot. It also does not mean you can stop checking moisture. In fact, a mulched container may look dry on top while remaining moist underneath, which is exactly why you should check below the mulch before watering again. The fifth practice is to keep mulch away from the crown and the main stem. Piling wet organic material against tomato stems, pepper crowns, bean stems, or the base of eggplant can create a constantly damp zone where tissues are more vulnerable. Leave a small open ring around the stem so you can inspect the base of the plant and direct water into the soil. With leafy greens, keep mulch away from the growing point and lower leaves. With root crops, use a fine, light mulch that does not bury seedlings or interfere with checking the shoulders of beets, radishes, or carrots. The objective is to shade the soil, not smother the crop. The sixth practice is to match the mulch to the plant and the container. Tomatoes and eggplants in large pots often benefit from a stable layer that remains in place through the season. Bush beans and okra need room around their stems and should not be crowded by heavy material. Leafy greens appreciate cooler soil but may attract slugs or other pests when mulch stays wet and dense. Root crops need a surface that remains loose enough for emergence and harvest. In humid climates, use thinner layers and inspect more often. In dry, windy climates, choose material that will not blow away easily. If herbicide exposure is uncertain, do not use grass clippings, hay, or manure from an unknown source. A regenerative practice is only useful when the material is clean and appropriate. Fresh grass clippings deserve special care. A thin layer from an untreated lawn can dry into mulch, but a thick, wet pile can compact, heat, and smell. Never use clippings from a lawn recently treated with products you cannot identify. Whole leaves can form a water-shedding mat, so shred them when possible. Straw should be clean and free of seed heads that would fill the pot with weeds. Fine wood chips can work on large containers, but very coarse pieces take up valuable surface space in small pots. Kitchen scraps do not belong directly around active roots. They can attract pests and decompose unpredictably. Finished compost goes into the soil system. Unfinished scraps go through a proper composting process first. As mulch decomposes, it becomes thinner. That is not failure. It is part of the reason the system must be maintained. Lift the layer occasionally, inspect the soil, and add only enough material to restore coverage. If ants, slugs, fungus, gnats, or other pests begin using the layer as shelter, identify the cause before simply adding more mulch. Excess moisture, decaying plant tissue, and poor sanitation may be contributing. Regenerative management means watching the whole system, including the pests that take advantage of imbalance. Mulch creates the first visible improvement, but it cannot rebuild a root zone that has collapsed, lost volume, or accumulated too much fertilizer. The seventh practice is to top dress with finished compost. Finished compost should smell earthy, feel crumbly, and no longer resemble hot, actively decomposing kitchen waste or fresh manure. Spread a modest layer over the surface rather than digging deeply into a container full of active roots. In many pots, a thin top dressing is enough to begin adding stable organic matter without burying the plant or reducing the space needed for watering. Gently pull back the mulch, apply the compost, water it in, and replace the mulch while keeping the stem clear. Compost can improve water holding, nutrient buffering, and the diversity of organic materials in the upper soil. But more is not automatically better. Filling the top of a container with a thick layer of dense compost can reduce aeration, hold too much moisture, or change the nutrient balance. Compost also does not replace the structural materials in a potting mix. If bark, perlite, pumice, or other coarse components have broken down, compost alone may not restore drainage. Think of compost as one part of a system, not as a universal repair product. For fruiting crops such as tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, it supports the soil, but the crop may still require balanced nutrition based on the product being used and the stage of growth. Finished compost also varies. Compost made primarily from leaves may be mild and structure building. Compost containing manure can be richer and may contribute more soluble nutrients. Bagged products differ in texture and analysis. That is another reason to start with a modest amount and observe the plant. If the pot is already filled to the rim, remove a little old surface mulch rather than burying the stem under amendments. Leave enough headspace to water without washing material over the edge. For seedlings and small greens, use especially fine, mature compost and avoid creating a dense crust. A simple maturity check is not perfect, but it is useful. The compost should no longer heat after being turned, should not smell like ammonia, and should not contain recognizable fresh food waste. If it smells sharp, sour, or strongly of manure, keep it out of an active root zone until it is properly finished. Regeneration depends on controlled decomposition. Active decomposition in a compost pile is valuable. Uncontrolled decomposition beside heat-stressed roots is not. The eighth practice is to use worm castings carefully. Worm castings are the processed material produced by worms and they are often easier to manage than adding live worms to a hot summer container. A small amount can be used as a top dressing or mixed lightly into the very top layer where roots are not being torn. Castings contribute stable organic matter and small amounts of nutrients, but they should not be treated as a complete fertilizer for every crop. A heavy-feeding tomato or eggplant can still develop deficiencies if the entire nutrition plan depends on castings alone. Beans may need less added nitrogen than fruiting crops, while leafy greens respond differently depending on how often they are harvested. Avoid the idea that if a little worm casting is helpful, a large amount must be better. Too much fine material can reduce pore space in a container mix. The goal is to support structure and biology, not to turn the pot into dense mud. If the existing mix is already fine and slow to drain, adding more fine material may worsen the problem. In that case, wait until the crop is removed and rebuild the mix with appropriate coarse components rather than trying to repair everything from the surface. Castings are most useful when they complement, rather than replace, the rest of the potting mix. Sprinkle them over a moist surface, water gently, and return the mulch. In a long planter of leafy greens, a light application can be distributed across the row. Tomato or pepper. Keep the material away from the stem and focus on the root zone under the canopy. If the product is very fine, blend it with a little finished compost rather than creating a sealed layer. Always check the package because moisture content and recommended use can differ. Worm tea and other liquid products are often marketed with dramatic promises. Treat them cautiously. A liquid can supply soluble compounds, but it cannot replace pore space, drainage, mulch, or sufficient container volume. An aerated or non-aerated homemade brew also introduces variables that are difficult for beginners to control. The most dependable strategy is still basic. Sound potting mix, even moisture, clean organic matter, appropriate nutrition, and protection from excessive heat. The ninth practice is to use slow-release organic fertilizer at the correct time and according to the label. A stressed plant is not automatically a hungry plant. When roots are dry, overheated, damaged, or sitting in oxygen-poor soil, adding concentrated fertilizer can increase stress. Stabilize moisture first. Protect the pot from extreme heat. Check for drainage problems. Then evaluate whether the plant shows a consistent nutrient need. If fertilizer is appropriate, follow the product directions for the container size and crop. Do not double the rate because leaves are pale. Do not pile granules against the stem. Do not apply a heavy feeding to bone-dry mix before a heat wave. Slow-release products can be useful because they supply nutrients over time rather than creating a sudden concentration. But release rates can vary with temperature and moisture, and different products have different analyses. There is no single universal scoop that is safe for every container. Tomatoes carrying fruit, peppers setting a new flush of flowers, leafy greens being harvested repeatedly, and root crops approaching maturity do not all need the same feeding strategy. Regenerative soil management does not reject fertilizer. It uses fertilizer as one tool while protecting the root environment that allows the plant to use those nutrients. Salt management is part of fertilizer management. Fertilizer salts can accumulate when water evaporates repeatedly, and the container is never watered deeply enough for excess minerals to leave. Hard irrigation water can add more minerals. A white crust is one visible clue, but root injury can begin before the deposit becomes dramatic. When the plant is healthy enough, the mix drains freely, and local water quality is suitable, occasional thorough watering can move some soluble salts downward and out. Never leach a pot that has blocked drainage, and do not allow the runoff to collect where it can be reabsorbed. Also, examine every source of nutrition going into the container. Compost, castings, granular fertilizer, liquid feed, fish emulsion, and fortified potting mix may all contribute nutrients. Gardeners sometimes apply each product at its full rate without realizing the total load. Keep a simple record of what was added and when. If a plant is growing dark green leaves but producing few flowers, more nitrogen may not help. If leaf edges burn while the soil remains moist, adding another feeding is risky. The safest response begins with observation. not another bottle. The 10th practice is to disturb the soil as little as possible while the crop is growing. Many gardeners see a crusted surface and immediately dig several inches deep with a hand fork. That can break fine roots, create new channels where water bypasses the center, and expose moist soil to faster drying. If the surface has formed a thin crust, loosen only the topmost layer gently and away from the main stem. In most cases, top dressing with compost and protecting the surface with mulch is safer than repeatedly turning the entire upper root zone. Major structural rebuilding belongs after harvest, when the plant can be removed and the condition of the entire mix can be evaluated. Minimal disturbance does not mean ignoring a pot that has become solid. It means choosing the least damaging intervention during active growth. If water cannot enter, use gradual re-wetting. If the surface is sealed, make shallow openings without cutting through the root mass. If roots have filled nearly the entire pot and the crop is still young enough to move, transplanting into a larger container may be the best option. But a mature tomato loaded with fruit may be harmed more by aggressive repotting than by careful surface management through the remainder of the season. The timing of the repair matters as much as the repair itself. Roots can reveal whether container volume has become the limiting factor. Roots circling on the surface, emerging heavily from every drainage hole, or forming a dense wall just beneath the pot edge, suggest that the plant has occupied most of the available space. A mature crop may still finish successfully with careful watering and mulch, but it will have less tolerance for missed irrigation. For next season, choose a larger container or a more compact variety. Regenerative soil care cannot make a 2-gallon pot function like a 10-gallon pot through an entire hot season. Avoid using stakes, moisture probes, or drip emitters in a way that repeatedly tears the same root zone. Install support systems early when possible. When adding a stake late, guide it near the outer edge and expect some resistance from roots. If an emitter creates one permanently wet pocket and leaves the rest dry, add another outlet or move the watering point. The healthiest container has moisture distributed through the root zone, not one muddy hole beside a dry mass. At this point, the soil may accept water more evenly, stay cooler, and receive a modest amount of organic matter and nutrition. But before adding more compost, castings, cover crops, or worms, ask a harder question. Is this soil still safe to rebuild? Regenerative gardening is not the same as saving every handful of old potting mix. Some containers contain problems that should be isolated rather than recycled through the rest of the garden. Be cautious when a plant has suffered a serious soil-borne disease, extensive root rot, or an unexplained decline that spread quickly through the root system. A sour odor, black or mushy roots, persistently stagnant mix, and a blocked drainage system are warning signs that the container needs more than a surface amendment. Severe salt accumulation is another concern. A small amount of white crust may sometimes be reduced through careful leaching with good quality water when drainage is excellent, but heavy accumulation, combined with damaged roots, may require partial or complete replacement. If the mix has broken down into fine, airless material, adding compost will not restore the missing pore space. Isolate a suspicious container from healthy pots. Remove diseased plant material and do not casually spread the old mix across other containers. Clean the pot before reuse. If the problem is structural and the plant was otherwise healthy, some of the soil may be reused later after it is rebuilt with fresh potting mix and coarse components. If contamination is possible or the disease risk is unknown, replacement is the safer choice. Do not add questionable material to a home compost pile unless you understand whether the composting process can manage that specific problem. The most regenerative decision is sometimes to protect the rest of the garden by discarding a small amount of unsafe material. Pest history matters as well. Root feeding larvae, persistent fungus gnat outbreaks, or nematode problems may require a different response from simple nutrient depletion. Removing the plant and drying, solarizing, or treating the mix is not automatically safe or effective for every pest, climate, or crop. When the cause is uncertain, consult a local extension service or reliable diagnostic resource before spreading the material. A small container is replaceable. A pest introduced into every planter can become a much larger problem. The container itself may be part of the failure. Cracked plastic can expose roots and lose moisture. A decorative pot without drainage can trap water around an inner nursery pot. A saucer that never empties can keep the lower mix saturated. Fabric that has become clogged with fine particles may drain differently than it did when new. Metal can corrode, and untreated wood can decay. Inspect the vessel while you inspect the soil. Sometimes, rebuilding the mix inside a damaged container only repeats the same problem. Once unsafe soil has been ruled out, the 11th practice is to keep healthy roots living in the soil whenever that fits the crop and the season. Living roots create channels. Support the area immediately around the root surface and help maintain structure. During the growing season, avoid unnecessary root cutting. After harvest, the fine roots of a healthy plant can sometimes be left to decompose in place while the thick crown and main stem are removed. Those fine roots become pathways for air and water as they break down. But roots from diseased plants should not be treated this way. Remove them along with the affected plant material. Living roots can also come from a planned follow-up crop. After an early bean crop finishes, a container may be replanted with a heat-tolerant leafy green, a small cover crop, or another edible crop suited to the season. The goal is not to keep every pot crowded at all times. It is to avoid leaving healthy soil bare, baking, and completely dry for weeks. Even an empty pot can be protected with mulch and occasional moisture if no crop is suitable. Soil biology needs moderation. A container kept permanently saturated is not healthier than one left as dust. Succession planting can maintain roots without overcrowding. Remove a finished bush bean, refresh the surface, and plant a small fall green when temperatures begin to moderate. Follow an early leafy crop with a compact bean where the remaining season is warm enough. Use a shallow-rooted crop after a deeper-rooted crop when container depth and timing allow. The exact sequence depends on local frost dates and heat, but the principle is stable. Keep the soil covered with a manageable crop rather than leaving it bare without a plan. When no edible crop fits, mulch is enough. A resting container does not have to prove its regeneration by growing something. Keep weeds from becoming large because they also consume water and may produce seed. Remove volunteer tomatoes or squash if they crowd the pot. A few deliberate roots are useful. A mass of uncontrolled growth is competition. The 12th practice is to use clover only where it fits. Clover can provide living roots and surface coverage, but it is not automatically a good companion for every tomato or pepper. In a small pot, both the crop and the clover draw from the same limited water supply. During extreme heat, that competition can become a problem. Clover is more practical in a large container, a broad planter, a container holding a long-lived edible plant, or a pot that is resting between main crops. Keep it trimmed, prevent it from covering the main stem, and remove or cut it back if the primary crop begins to compete for moisture. Do not assume clover will supply all the nitrogen another plant needs. Nitrogen fixation involves a relationship between the clover and compatible bacteria, and much of that nitrogen remains within the clover system while the plant is growing. Clover can still be useful for roots, cover, and organic material, but it should not be advertised as free fertilizer that instantly feeds a neighboring tomato. In containers, the best cover crop is the one you can manage without reducing the performance of the crop you actually want to harvest. The 13th practice is to use buckwheat as a short-term cover crop in a resting container. Buckwheat grows quickly in warm conditions, creates a network of roots, and produces material that can be cut before it becomes too large. It is most useful after a crop is removed or in a large pot not currently supporting a heavy feeder. Sow it lightly rather than creating a dense jungle. Keep the container evenly moist during establishment. Cut the plants before unwanted seed production, and use healthy, pest-free tops as a light mulch or add them to an appropriate compost system. Buckwheat should not be crowded around a thirsty tomato during a heat wave. It is a tool for soil coverage and transition periods, not a compulsory companion plant. In a small container, a simple mulch may protect the soil with less competition. In a larger bed or oversized planter, a short buckwheat phase can maintain living roots before the next edible crop is planted. The regenerative choice depends on space, water, and timing. Clover and buckwheat are examples, not requirements. Other cover crops may suit different regions and seasons, but container gardeners should prioritize manageability. Choose a crop that can be cut before it becomes woody, does not spread aggressively, and can complete useful growth within the available weather window. Do not introduce a plant that is invasive in your area. In a shared balcony or rental property, prevent seed from blowing into neighboring spaces. When cutting a healthy cover crop, leave the roots in place and cut the top near the soil line. Use a thin layer of the cut foliage as mulch only if it is free of pests and disease. Too much fresh green material can form a wet layer, so allow some to wilt or send the excess to a compost system. The roots will gradually break down and leave channels. That slow transition is more useful than pulling the whole crop and immediately exposing the soil again. The 14th practice is to add live worms only to systems that can support them. Worms need moisture, oxygen, food, and protection from extreme heat. A small black pot that becomes hot and dry by afternoon is not a stable habitat. A large, self-watering planter, a deep container protected from sun, or a dedicated worm-friendly system may be more suitable. Even then, the environment must not remain waterlogged. Do not collect random worms and place them into every grow bag. Different worms occupy different habitats, and the pot may not provide what they need. For most container gardeners, finished worm castings are simpler and more predictable than maintaining a live worm population in each pot. If worms appear naturally in a large, healthy container and the conditions remain suitable, they can be part of the system. But their presence is not proof that the soil is perfect, and their absence does not mean the soil is dead. Regeneration is about function. Does the soil take in water? Does it drain? Does it hold enough moisture? Are the roots able to breathe? Can the plant continue producing healthy growth? Those questions matter more than whether one particular organism is visible. The 15th practice is to rebuild the container immediately after harvest, instead of waiting until the next planting day. Begin by evaluating the plant you just removed. Was it healthy, or did it show signs of disease? Were the roots firm and normally colored, or were they dark, mushy, and foul-smelling? Did the container drain well? Was the mix still coarse and springy, or had it collapsed into fine material? This end-of-season inspection tells you whether the soil can be refreshed, partially replaced, or should be discarded. Remove diseased stems, leaves, roots, and contaminated mulch. For a healthy crop, remove the thick crown and main woody roots, while allowing some fine roots to remain, if the mix is still sound. Break up only the areas that have become compacted, and do this after the crop is gone, not while the active roots are trying to support fruit. Restore lost volume with fresh potting mix. Add finished compost in a moderate amount. If drainage has slowed because coarse components have decomposed, include fresh structural material appropriate for container growing. Avoid filling pots with heavy garden soil, which can compact and drain poorly in a confined space. Check the drainage holes before the next crop. Roots, old fabric, mineral deposits, or settled mix can block them. Clean the container rim and exterior. If salt accumulation is mild and the pot drains freely, repeated deep watering may help move soluble salts out of the root zone. But do not attempt this in a container that cannot drain. If the mix remains sour, airless, or heavily contaminated, replace it. Rebuilding is economical only when the result is a safe, functional root environment. Choose what happens next. If another edible crop suits the season, plant it before the soil sits exposed. Beans, leafy greens, or root crops may follow a fruiting crop when temperature, container depth, and local timing are appropriate. Crop rotation in containers does not erase disease, but it can reduce repeated pressure from the same nutrient demands and the same crop family. Avoid planting tomato, pepper, and eggplant into the same questionable pot year after year without evaluating disease risk and rebuilding the mix. If the pot will rest, cover the surface. Use mulch, or plant a manageable cover crop in a container large enough to support it. Keep the mix slightly moist so it does not become completely water resistant, but do not maintain it as a swamp. Before the next planting, check the smell, texture, drainage, volume, and salt crust. Replenish what has been lost. A few minutes of inspection after harvest can prevent weeks of confusion during the hottest part of the next season. A practical rotation plan can be simple. Mark the container with the crop family and season. After tomato, pepper, or eggplant, consider a bean, leafy green, or root crop only when the temperature and pot size suit it. After beans, avoid assuming the soil now contains unlimited nitrogen. Refresh and assess it like any other pot. After root crops, sift only when the main crop is finished. Remove damaged or diseased roots and rebuild the volume that was lost during harvest. After leafy greens, inspect for compacted fine roots and pest residue before replanting. Store empty containers thoughtfully. A pot left under a roof may become completely dry. A pot left uncovered in heavy rain may stay saturated and lose nutrients through drainage. Mulch the surface, place the container where extreme weather is reduced, and check it occasionally. The soil does not need constant feeding while it rests. It needs protection from erosion, severe drying, and prolonged waterlogging. A simple maintenance rhythm keeps the improvements from disappearing. At each watering, notice whether the surface accepts water evenly. Once or twice a week during the hottest period, lift the mulch in 2 locations and check moisture below it. After a strong storm or an unusually heavy irrigation, confirm that the saucer is empty and the drainage holes are still working. When feeding, write the date and product in a small garden note. At harvest, remove damaged leaves and fallen fruit so they do not decay on the soil. These small observations take less effort than rescuing a severely stressed root system, and they help you catch gradual changes before the plant loses an entire flush of flowers. Finally, do not add every regenerative material on the same day. Compost, castings, fertilizer, mulch, cover crops, and live worms each change the system in a different way. Applying all of them at once makes it difficult to know what helped and increases the risk of excess moisture, excess nutrients, or competition. Begin with the limiting factor. If the soil is dry and hot, restore moisture and reduce heat. If it drains poorly, address structure after harvest. If nutrition is genuinely low, feed according to the product and crop. If the pot is resting, consider living roots. Regeneration works best as a sequence of thoughtful corrections, not as a pile of ingredients. Imagine the original tomato container after these changes. Instead of pouring fertilizer onto a hard, dry surface, you first re-wet the root ball in stages. You move the pot away from the wall that radiates afternoon heat and raise it slightly from the concrete. You add a modest layer of finished compost, cover it with clean, loose mulch, and keep the stem exposed. You wait until moisture is stable before deciding whether the plant actually needs fertilizer. Over the following days, the goal is not a miraculous transformation. The goal is a root zone that changes more slowly and predictably. The same logic adapts to every crop. A pepper in a black nursery pot needs root protection and consistent moisture more than repeated emergency feeding. An eggplant carrying fruit needs room, airflow, and a mix that drains while holding enough water. Beans need even moisture without excessive nitrogen. Okra tolerates heat, but still benefits from a cool, covered root zone. Leafy greens need protection from rapid drying and may need afternoon shade in addition to healthy soil. Root crops need a loose, evenly moist mix that is not disturbed while the roots are forming. The practices are shared, but the way you apply them must respect the crop. Now bring all 15 practices together. First, diagnose how the soil is failing. Rehydrate dry mix, gradually. Protect the container from excessive heat. Cover the surface with clean mulch. Keep the mulch away from stems. Match the material to the crop. Top dress with finished compost. Use worm castings in moderation. Apply slow-release fertilizer only when it is actually needed. Avoid deep disturbance during active growth. Preserve healthy living roots. Use clover selectively. Use buckwheat during suitable transition periods. Maintain live worms only in a system that can support them, and rebuild the container as soon as the crop is finished. None of these practices is a miracle on its own. Their value comes from the way they restore balance. Water must enter the mix instead of racing around it. Excess water must leave. Air must remain around the roots. The container must not become an oven. Organic matter must support structure without turning the mix into mud. Nutrients must be available without accumulating to damaging levels. Living roots and organisms must have enough space, moisture, oxygen, and food. That is what it means to keep container soil alive and productive. Do not judge success only by the number of fruits harvested the next day. Look for water soaking in more evenly. Notice whether the pot stays moist for a reasonable period instead of swinging from saturated to bone dry. Watch whether the plant recovers from afternoon stress by evening. Examine new leaves rather than expecting damaged old leaves to become perfect again. Observe whether flowers remain attached and whether existing fruit continues to develop. Soil recovery creates better conditions, but the plant still responds according to its age, variety, weather, and previous damage. Before you water or fertilize the weakest container in your garden again, stop and test the soil. Watch how the water moves. Feel the moisture beneath the mulch. Check the weight, drainage, smell, and surface crust. Then choose the practice that matches the problem instead of adding every amendment at once. The plant above the surface can only be as resilient as the environment surrounding its roots. Care for that environment, and your tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, beans, okra, leafy greens, and root crops will have a far better chance of remaining productive through extreme summer heat.